My name is Claire Mitchell. I am 32, and I used to believe Christmas Eve was about warmth, family, and traditions. That night I walked into my parents' house in Newton. The trees sparkled, the table was set, and everything looked perfect from the outside. But behind the laughter and holiday decorations, old wounds opened fast. A gift meant for love turned into fuel for resentment, and words spoken at that table changed everything between us. What they never realized was the secret I had been carrying quietly for years, the kind of secret that can shatter or save a family. So when the storm finally broke that night, I had to decide if I would stay silent yet again or walk away for good. What would you have done if it were your Christmas Eve? I promise this story will take you deeper than you expect. Let me take you back to where it began. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out of the car, staring at the Mitchell house glowing on the quiet street in Newton, Massachusetts. Every window flickered with warm yellow light, and the front porch was lined with garland and bows. It looked like the perfect Christmas Eve postcard. My stomach tightened the way it always did before I walked through that door. No matter how beautiful the outside looked, I knew the storm waiting inside. I pulled my coat tighter around me and carried the carefully wrapped box in my hand. Inside was the Rolex my father once admired years ago, in a magazine, a gift I had worked months to afford. Tonight, I wanted to give him something special. Maybe it would soften the edges of what had become our brittle family gatherings. The door opened before I could knock. My mother, Margaret, stood there in a red sweater, her hair pulled back neatly. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You finally made it. Dinner's already on the table." I stepped in and shook off the cold. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted from the kitchen, mixed with the pine from the tall tree decorated in the living room. Lights twinkled, presents stacked neatly beneath. On the surface, it was everything a holiday should be, yet I felt like an unwelcome guest in my own childhood home. My father, Robert, sat in his armchair by the fireplace with a glass of wine in hand. He gave me a nod, tired but warm, and gestured for me to come closer. My brother Daniel, home from Seattle for the holidays, leaned against the doorway scrolling on his phone. My sister Emily was arranging silverware at the table, always the peacemaker. Margaret looked me over from head to toe. "You cut your hair again," she said flatly. It was finally starting to look nice when it was longer. I forced a smile. "It's easier for work this way." "Work," she muttered under her breath as she walked back to the dining room. We gathered at the table. Crystal glasses, polished silver, the good china only brought out for Christmas Eve. Margaret had prepared everything exactly the way she liked. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. She took her seat at the head of the table as though presiding over a court. Dinner started with the usual questions about Daniel's job at the tech company in Seattle and Emily's students at the high school in New Jersey. Both answers were met with approving nods. When the attention turned to me, Margaret waved her fork as if dismissing the subject before it even began. "Claire works with money," she said lightly. "That's about all you need to know." Robert glanced at me apologetically but stayed silent. I felt the familiar sting the way my work was reduced to nothing more than a hobby. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting small pieces of turkey to keep my hands steady. After the plates were cleared, I stood and went to the tree. My heart pounded as I picked up the box wrapped in blue paper and tied with silver ribbon. I set it down in front of my father. "Merry Christmas, Dad." Robert looked surprised, then slowly unwrapped the gift. When he opened the box, his eyes widened. He held the Rolex in his hands, turning it as though it might disappear. "Claire, this is too much. You've always wanted one." "You deserve it," I said softly. For a brief moment, I saw joy on his face, the kind I remembered from childhood. But before the moment could settle, Margaret's voice cut through. "Must be nice to throw money around like that." The room went still. She leaned back in her chair, her tone sharp. "Showing off with flashy gifts while the rest of us count pennies." "Mom, that's not fair," Emily said quickly, but Margaret waved her off. Daniel put down his phone and smirked. "Guess business is good for you, huh, Claire?" I swallowed hard, heat rising in my face. "It's just a gift. I wanted to do something nice for Dad." Margaret shook her head. "Always trying to prove something. always making sure we know how successful you are." Robert shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me, then back at the watch. He took a long sip of wine and said nothing. The tree lights blinked steadily behind him, while the air at the table grew heavier with every passing second. I sat back down, my appetite gone, the turkey and mashed potatoes turning cold on my plate. The voices around me blurred, Margaret's tone, sharp and insistent, Daniel's laughter low, Emily trying to smooth over the tension. All I could feel was the weight of being singled out again, even on Christmas Eve, even when all I had wanted was one peaceful night. The Rolex gleamed under the chandelier, catching the light as my father slipped it onto his wrist. For him, it was a dream fulfilled. For me, it had already turned into another reason to be reminded that in this house, nothing I did was ever enough. The meal continued, but I barely heard the words. I stared at the flickering candles and wondered how much longer I could sit there, pretending this was still my family's Christmas. Margaret's fork scraped against her plate, a sharp sound that cut through the low murmur of conversation. She looked straight at me and shook her head. "Always chasing something, Claire. You think a shiny watch makes up for what you lack." My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. Robert cleared his throat as if to interrupt, but instead reached for the wine bottle and filled his glass to the brim. Daniel smirked, his eyes flicking between me and our mother like he was watching a tennis match. Emily kept her gaze lowered, trying to smooth the napkin on her lap, as though if she kept her hands busy, none of this would be real. Margaret leaned forward, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Tell me, Claire, when was the last time you actually put your family ahead of your career? You sit there with your nice clothes and your fancy job, but where were you when we needed you most?" I clenched my hands beneath the table. "I have always been here," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "What was that?" she snapped. Before I could repeat myself, Robert slammed his palm on the table. "Enough." His voice was rough, louder than I had heard in years. Margaret's eyes widened for a moment, then narrowed. She wasn't used to being silenced. Robert stood unsteady on his feet, his cheeks flushed from the wine. He looked at me, his jaw tight. "Get out!" The words hung heavy in the air. Emily gasped. "Dad, what are you doing?" Robert's eyes didn't leave mine. "Get out, and never come back." The room spun. I felt the heat rush to my face, the sting of humiliation rising like a tide. My brother's smirk turned into something meaner, almost satisfied. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line, triumphant. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear my own breath. I looked around the table once at the family I had spent my whole life trying to please. My mother's cold stare, my father's clenched jaw, Daniel's mocking grin, Emily's stricken face. Without a word, I rose to my feet, walked to the hallway and pulled my coat from the rack. My fingers fumbled with the buttons as I tried to steady myself. The box the watch had come in sat discarded on the sideboard, the silver ribbon torn. I couldn't even look at it. The front door creaked open and a blast of cold air rushed in. Behind me, Emily's voice trembled. "Claire, please don't go like this." I turned slightly, my hand still on the door. He told me to leave. "I'm finally listening." I stepped out into the night. Snow fell heavier now, coating the driveway and the bare branches of the trees. The cold bit into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the ache inside. I walked down the path, the crunch of snow beneath my boots, the only sound. The windows of the house glowed behind me, warm and golden, but I felt none of it. I reached my car, pulled the door open, and sat inside. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I tried to breathe. I had always told myself I would never let them push me out, never let them win. And yet, here I was exiled from my own family on Christmas Eve. The engine rumbled to life, and I sat there a moment longer, staring at the house through the windshield. I half expected the door to fly open for my father to come running, apologizing, begging me to stay. The door never opened. With a heavy heart, I shifted the car into gear and pulled away. The tires crunched through the snow as I drove down the quiet street, lined with houses glowing with lights and wreaths. Families inside were laughing, singing carols, sharing gifts. I drove past them, invisible, a hollow shell, moving forward because staying put was no longer an option. The city lights of Boston came into view, an hour later, the familiar skyline rising against the dark winter sky. I parked in front of my small apartment building, climbed the steps slowly, and unlocked the door. The silence inside wrapped around me. No tree, no presence, no warm smells of cooking. Just the hum of the heater and the faint city sounds outside. I slipped off my coat and let it fall onto the couch. My body felt heavy, drained. I wandered into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. The Rolex gleamed in my mind, my father's face lighting up for only a second before my mother's words poisoned it. That brief flicker of happiness, buried under years of resentment. I sat down at the table, staring at the faint scratches on the surface, and let the tears finally come. They fell silently warm against my cold cheeks, until I buried my face in my hands. Outside, fireworks cracked in the distance, someone celebrating Christmas Eve with joy. I stayed there in the dark, listening, wondering if I had finally reached the breaking point, or if somehow this was just the beginning. The morning light crept through the blinds, sharp and unforgiving. I sat at the small kitchen table, my head heavy from a night of broken sleep. My phone lay face down in front of me, silent, though I had half expected it to be buzzing with calls. Nothing, not a word from them. The quiet should have been comforting, but it gnawed at me. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, letting the steam warm my face. The images from the night before kept replaying in my mind, looping, until I thought I might go mad. My father's flushed face, his voice breaking with anger. My mother's triumphant smirk. Daniel's smirk that said he was glad it was me and not him. Emily's wide, tearful eyes. I tried to tell myself it was only words, that it didn't matter. But the truth was, it cut deeper than anything. My own father had cast me out on Christmas Eve. My gaze drifted to the folder of bills stacked neatly on the counter. That was when the memories came rushing back, the part they never knew, about the part I had carried alone for years. It was late in the summer of 2019 when I found my father sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. His shoulders were hunched, his hands pressed to his temples. I had never seen him look so small. I had asked what was wrong, and he tried to brush me off, but the truth slipped out in fragments. He had been laid off, severance barely covering a few months. They were already 3 months behind on the mortgage. The house, the one my mother guarded like a crown jewel, was at risk of foreclosure. I remember sitting down beside him, my heart pounding as he confessed how bad it was. He begged me not to say anything to my mother, not yet. She would never handle the shame, he said. She would rather die than admit they could not keep up the life they had built. I had nodded, but inside I was terrified. The next day, I called the bank myself. I set up automatic payments from my account, $2,200 a month. It was a huge cut into my salary, even as a financial advisor climbing the ladder. But I told myself I could manage. I lived modestly, I had savings. More than that, I could not stand the thought of my parents losing the home I grew up in. The first payment cleared and no one said a word. My father pretended his part-time hardware store job was enough. My mother kept redecorating and hosting dinner parties as if nothing had changed. And I kept paying. Month after month, year after year. Taxes came due, late fees stacked up, and sometimes even credit card debt bled into the pile. I covered that too. When I added it all up recently, it was over $200,000. Money I could have used to buy my own condo, start my own life, travel, do anything but bleed it out into a house that treated me like a stranger. I pressed my palms against my face and let out a shaky breath. I had done all that, and still in the end I was told to get out and never come back. The clock on the wall ticked past 10. My phone finally buzzed, but it was only a notification from the office. No family, no apologies. Just silence. Maybe they were still eating leftovers, laughing in that dining room, as if I had never been there. Maybe they were pretending I had never existed. I stood restless and began pacing the apartment. The space was small, 1 bedroom, barely enough for my things, but it was mine. Paid for with what little was left after sending money to them. I thought about the lavender walls of my old bedroom at the Newton house still frozen in time, trophies on the shelf books I had loved, the marks on the kitchen doorframe where Dad used to measure my height. I had clung to those memories whenever I doubted why I kept sacrificing. The truth pressed in hard. That house was not mine anymore. It never had been. I was only ever tolerated inside it, and now I was banished. The kettle on the stove whistled softly, pulling me back. I turned it off, poured more hot water, and sat again. I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank records. Line after line of payments stared back at me, stretching over 3 years. I scrolled slowly, the weight of every dollar pressing down on me. 70,000. 120. Finally, 200,000. I whispered the number aloud, stunned at how large it sounded. For a moment, I wondered if it had been worth it. If maybe deep down I had only been trying to buy my mother's approval, my father's respect, my siblings' recognition. If I thought money could fix the cracks in our family, I had been wrong. All it bought me was silence and resentment. I closed the laptop with a snap and leaned back. The apartment was too quiet, my thoughts too loud. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the only person who came to mind was Sophia. She was the one who had always told me I was giving too much, that love did not mean erasing yourself. I picked up the phone, then set it down again. Not yet. I needed to sit with this. I needed to understand that the truth of what I had done did not make me weak. It made me strong. Outside, the city moved on without me. Cars passed, children laughed in the distance, neighbors carried grocery bags up the stairs. Life went on ordinary and steady. I sat in the stillness of my apartment, staring at the folder of bills again, and finally admitted what I had never said aloud. I had saved their house, but in the process I had lost my place inside it. The knock on my door came just as I was rinsing out my coffee cup. I froze, my mind jumping straight to the possibility that somehow my parents had come looking for me. But when I opened it, relief flooded me. Sophia stood there with her scarf half undone and a paper bag from the deli in her hands. I let her in without a word, and she dropped the bag on the counter, pulling me into a hug. I didn't realize how tightly I was holding on until she whispered that I was crushing her ribs. I stepped back, blinking away tears. "You look like hell," she said, gently taking off her coat. "Thanks," I muttered, forcing a weak smile. She unpacked sandwiches and chips, setting them on the table like we were back in college cramming for finals. Except this time the weight wasn't exams. It was my family. She poured us both glasses of water and sat across from me. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the dinner, about Margaret's sneers, about Robert slamming his hand down and shouting for me to get out. I told her how I had walked away into the snow, how the silence in this apartment had been both suffocating and freeing. And then slowly I told her about the payments. The 3 years, the mortgage, the taxes, the late fees. All of it. $200,000 gone. Her eyes widened as she listened, but she didn't interrupt. When I finally ran out of words, she sat back in her chair and blew out a long breath. "Claire," she said softly, "honey, this isn't just unkind. This is abuse." The words stung. I wanted to argue, to defend them, but nothing came. She leaned forward, her voice firmer now. "You've been carrying them on your back, draining yourself dry, and they've been treating you like dirt. That is not normal. That is not healthy." I rubbed my hands together, trying to steady the shake in them. "They're my parents. What was I supposed to do, let them lose the house?" "Maybe they should have," she said simply. "Maybe that was the lesson they needed. Instead, you stepped in, and they never had to face reality." I stared at her, stunned. The thought had crossed my mind in the darkest corners of my heart, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're 32. You've worked your tail off, built a career, saved every penny, and yet you've sacrificed your own future so they could keep pretending. Where are your boundaries, Claire?" The question hit hard. Boundaries. In our house, that word never existed. To set one was selfish. To say no was betrayal. I had been raised on that belief. And now here was my best friend staring me down, telling me I had to break it. I swallowed, my voice cracking. "If I stop, they'll hate me. They already do. Sophia said quietly. At least this way you'll have your life back. Tears slid down my cheeks before I could stop them. I covered my face with my hands, ashamed of how raw I felt. She stood and came around the table, wrapping her arms around me. You don't have to decide tonight, but you do have to see it for what it is. This isn't love, Claire. Love doesn't demand you burn yourself out to keep someone else warm. We sat like that for a long time, the hum of the heater filling the silence. I thought of my father measuring my height on the kitchen doorway when I was small, my mother braiding my hair before school. Were those moments real, or had they just been rare fragments in a storm of criticism and control? I wiped my eyes and pulled back. So what do I do now? You live your life, she said simply. You stop pouring into a well that has no bottom. You let them face the consequences of their choices. Her words lingered as she gathered her things and kissed my cheek before leaving. The apartment felt different after she was gone. Not quite lighter, but sharper somehow, like the truth had cut through the fog I had been living in. I cleaned up the plates and sat back down at the table, staring at the empty chair where she had been. My chest still ached, but for the first time in a long time I could feel the faintest flicker of something else. Maybe it was anger, maybe it was hope. Whatever it was mine. The office lobby buzzed with the usual Monday morning chaos, the clatter of heels on marble floors, the low hum of phones already ringing. I pulled my coat tighter around me and forced a smile for the receptionist before stepping into the elevator. The ride up to the 22nd floor always felt like a slow climb into another version of myself. At home, I was fragile, wounded. Here, I was expected to be sharp, composed, unshakable. When I walked through the glass doors of Bayside Wealth Management, the smell of coffee and the faint scent of polished wood hit me. My assistant Jenna hurried over, her eyes wide. Claire, Mr. Carter wants you in the conference room in 5 minutes. It's about the Wexler account. My stomach tightened. The Wexlers were one of our biggest clients, an old family with money that stretched back generations. If something was wrong, it wasn't going to be minor. I thanked Jenna and set my bag down at my desk, smoothing my blazer before heading toward the conference room. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Mr. Carter stood at the head of the long table, arms folded, while 3 members of the Wexler family sat stiffly across from him. Their patriarch, George Wexler, glared at a stack of papers as though it had personally insulted him. His daughter tapped her nails impatiently, and his son shifted restlessly in his chair. Claire, thank you for joining us, Carter said. The Wexlers are concerned about last quarter's performance and want clarification on the strategy moving forward. I nodded, forcing calm. I had prepared reports on this very issue, anticipating the questions. Still, my heart raced as I took my seat, aware of the way George's eyes bore into me. He wasted no time. My portfolio lost value. You said you were diversifying, but I see losses here. Why am I paying for advice that bleeds money? I leaned forward, my voice steady. Markets dipped in several sectors, but the diversification limited your exposure. If we had stayed concentrated, your losses would have been triple. What looks like a setback is actually proof the strategy is working. His daughter frowned. That sounds like spin. I slid the report across the table, pointing to the graphs. Here are the benchmarks compared to your account. You're ahead, not behind. The downturn hurt, but you weathered it better than most. There was a pause as they studied the pages. George grumbled, still dissatisfied, but the numbers were undeniable. Mr. Carter glanced at me, the faintest nod of approval crossing his face. The son finally spoke. So you're saying we should stay the course? Exactly. Adjustments, yes, but no drastic changes. Pulling out now would lock in losses. Staying steady means recovery. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then George leaned back, gruff, but conceding. Fine, we'll trust the plan. Relief washed over me, though I kept my expression controlled. After a few more questions, the meeting ended. As the Wexlers left, Carter placed a hand on the table and looked at me. Well done. You kept your head when it mattered. I smiled faintly. Thank you. He straightened, lowering his voice. Clients like the Wexlers don't forgive easily. You earned their confidence back today. That's not small. His words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. At home, I was constantly diminished, but here, in this glass tower above the city, I was seen. I was valued. Back at my desk, Jenna set down a fresh cup of coffee. "You were amazing in there," she whispered. "Everyone could hear how mad George was, but you handled it like a pro." I thanked her, though my hands trembled slightly as I lifted the cup. The adrenaline was still coursing through me. Later that afternoon, as the office settled into its rhythm, I sat at my desk staring out at the frozen Charles River. My reflection in the glass looked calm, professional, untouchable. But beneath it, I was still reeling from Christmas Eve, still carrying the ache of my father's words. Daniel's smirk flashed through my mind, my mother's glee at seeing me cut down. The humiliation was a wound that throbbed no matter how hard I tried to bury it under client reports and investment strategies. I turned back to my computer, forcing myself into focus. Numbers never judged me. They didn't sneer or compare or push me out into the snow. They made sense. They told a story, and that was something I could control. Around 5, Carter stopped by my desk. He rested his hand lightly on the edge, his expression thoughtful. "Claire, have you ever considered managing your own team?" My breath caught. Not seriously, no. "You should. Today proved you're ready. We'll talk more after the new year." He walked away, leaving me stunned. A team. Leadership. A promotion I hadn't even dared to hope for. For the first time in days, a genuine smile tugged at my lips. It felt strange, almost foreign, but real. I packed my bag that evening and stepped out into the cold. The city's streets glistened with leftover holiday lights, couples clutching shopping bags, children pointing at window displays. Life around me sparkled with cheer, and I stood in the middle of it, somewhere between the weight of my family's rejection and the fragile glow of new possibility. As I walked toward my car, my phone buzzed. I froze, pulling it out of my pocket. The screen lit with a name I had avoided since Christmas Eve. My father. The call went to voicemail before I could decide. I slid the phone back into my bag and drove off, the city lights trailing in my rearview mirror. The question of whether to answer lingering like smoke I could not wave away. The first envelope showed up 2 weeks after Christmas. It was thin, stamped with the logo of the bank and addressed to Robert Mitchell. It had been slid under my parents' door by the mailman, but Emily later told me Margaret opened it first. Inside was a late payment notice, polite but stern, reminding them that the mortgage had not been paid for January. Margaret had waved it off, convinced it was a mistake, but when the second envelope arrived a week later, thicker, and stamped in red, the panic set in. I didn't know any of this until the voicemails started piling up. My phone lit up every morning, every lunch break, every night. The first messages were calm enough, Robert asking me to call back Margaret, insisting I straighten something out with the bank. By the third day, the tone had shifted. Margaret's voice was sharp, accusing. She demanded to know what I had done, what game I was playing. Robert's voice trembled, begging me not to abandon them. I listened to one voicemail on my commute home, Robert's voice cracking as he said, "Claire, please, they are threatening foreclosure. We cannot lose this house. Just call me, please." My hand gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. At my apartment, I dropped my bag on the couch and stared at the wall. The silence was heavy, broken only by the muffled sounds of a neighbor's television. The messages replayed in my head, the desperation and the blame mixed together, and I felt my chest tighten. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the table, and opened my laptop. For years, those payments had left my account like clockwork, hidden from everyone but me. I had turned off the automatic transfers after Christmas Eve, and the emptiness in the ledger now stood out like a scar. The numbers had stopped, but the consequences were only beginning. The next morning, another envelope arrived at my parents' house, this time marked urgent. Emily called me in a hushed voice. "Claire, I think you need to know. They are freaking out. Mom says the bank is threatening to start the foreclosure process. Dad can barely look at her." I closed my eyes, the weight pressing down harder. Emily lowered her voice further. "They keep saying your name. They think you had something to do with this. Did you?" I wanted to tell her everything right then, but the words caught in my throat. "Not yet," I whispered. "I can't." She sighed, torn. I'm trying to keep the peace, but Claire, they are unraveling. The calls kept coming. At first 10 a day, then 15. My phone buzzed through meetings, through dinner, through the quiet hours before dawn. I silenced it, but the notifications stacked up like a wall I couldn't ignore. One evening, as I was finishing a report at the office, Mr. Carter passed by my desk. "You all right, Claire? You look pale." I forced a smile, assuring him I was fine, but inside I was unraveling too. My work demanded precision and calm, but my personal life was collapsing behind the scenes. That night, I let one of Robert's calls go to voicemail and listened immediately. His voice was ragged. "Claire, they say they'll take the house if we don't pay by the end of the month. I don't know what to do. Please, sweetheart, we need you." The end of the month. My chest tightened. For 3 years, that house had been saved by my quiet sacrifices. Now, with a few short weeks, the mask was slipping, and they were facing the reality they had ignored. I sat on my couch, staring at the blinking light on my phone, the sound of his pleading still echoing. I could feel the weight of 100 choices pressing down, to answer or to ignore, to reveal the truth or keep it buried, to save them again or finally let go. The apartment was silent, the hum of the refrigerator the only noise as another call lit up the screen. Margaret's name this time. I let it ring, my heart pounding with every buzz until the sound cut off and the room went quiet once more. The next morning, my phone lit up before I even poured my first cup of coffee. This time it was Daniel. I let it buzz twice before I finally answered, bracing myself. His voice came through sharp, full of judgment. "What the hell is going on, Claire? Mom and Dad are losing their minds, the bank is after them, and they say you're refusing to help." I closed my eyes, leaning against the counter. "Daniel, you don't know the whole story." "I know enough," he snapped. "You have the money. You're sitting there in Boston with your cushy job and your nice apartment while our parents are about to be thrown out of their house. What kind of daughter does that make you?" My grip tightened on the phone. For years I had swallowed my tongue around him, but something in me broke. "You think I've done nothing? For 3 years I've been paying their mortgage, Daniel. Not you, not Emily, not anyone else. Me. Over $200,000. Silence, then laughter, bitter and disbelieving. "That's insane. You expect me to believe that?" I felt my throat tighten, hot tears stinging my eyes. "I don't care if you believe me. I've got the bank statements." Daniel's tone hardened. "If that's true, then you're a fool. And if it's not, then you're heartless. Either way, you've abandoned them." The call clicked off before I could reply. I stared at the screen, shaking. My brother had always been distant, but this felt final. He didn't want the truth. He wanted someone to blame, and I was the easiest target. By the time I reached the office, my head was pounding. I forced myself through meetings, nodded at clients, answered questions, but my mind kept circling back to that call. At lunch, I sat alone in the break room, picking at a salad I couldn't eat. My phone buzzed again. "Emily's name?" I hesitated, then answered. "Claire." Her voice was soft, careful. "I just talked to Mom. She's frantic. Dad's drinking more than ever. Daniel says you're refusing to help." "Is that true?" I pressed my hand to my forehead. "Emily, I can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" She sounded confused, almost hurt. "Covering for them. Paying for everything while they tear me apart." There was a pause, then her whisper. "What do you mean?" I swallowed hard. "For the last 3 years, I've been paying their mortgage. Every month, $2,200 plus taxes, plus fees. Over $200,000, Emily." The silence on the other end was heavy. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, you really did that?" "Yes, and they never knew. Dad pretended his part-time job was enough. Mom kept spending like nothing was wrong. And all the while, I drained my savings to keep that house afloat." I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven. "Claire, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew you'd try to stop me. And because I thought maybe if I kept them safe, they'd finally see me differently." She let out a shaky sob. "And instead they told you to get out on Christmas Eve." "Exactly." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily said, "I need to tell them. Do what you want. Just know it won't change anything. Mom will twist it. Dad will hide behind her. And Daniel, He already thinks I'm the villain. Still, she whispered, they need to know. That night I sat on my couch staring at my silent phone. For once the calls had stopped. I imagined Emily standing in their kitchen confronting them with the truth. I pictured Margaret's face tightening, her denial sharp and quick. I pictured Robert sinking into his chair, his glass of whiskey trembling in his hand. When the phone finally rang again, it was Emily. Her voice was raw, like she had been crying. I told them, she said simply. And Dad looked like someone had punched him. Mom called you a liar, said you fabricated everything. I showed them the screenshots you sent me. Dad didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor. I closed my eyes, my chest heavy. And Mom, she said, if it was true, you only did it to make them feel small. That you were trying to humiliate them. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Emily's voice broke. I don't know how you've lived with this. The truth hung between us, painful but undeniable. My secret was no longer mine alone. The cracks in our family had widened into a chasm, and there was no going back. Emily's voice still echoed in my ears, long after we hung up. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my apartment cloaked in darkness, except for the glow of the streetlight outside. The truth was out now, and instead of relief I felt exposed. My secret sacrifice, the one thing I had clung to, as proof that I wasn't as selfish as my mother claimed, had become another weapon for her to twist. The next morning I woke to a string of new voicemails. My hand hovered over the phone before I pressed play. Margaret's voice snapped through the speaker. How dare you spread lies about us, Claire? Do you think paying a few bills gives you the right to shame your family? You're pathetic. The next message was Robert's, quieter, broken. Claire, I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me? Why would you do that in secret? Please call me. The third was Daniel, furious. You've humiliated them. You've humiliated all of us. I set the phone down, my stomach in knots. The apartment felt smaller than ever, walls pressing in. I paced back and forth, trying to steady my breathing. I thought about deleting the messages, pretending they didn't exist, but curiosity pulled me back. I needed to hear it all, even if it tore me apart. By noon, I couldn't focus on work. My reports sat unfinished, my email inbox overflowing. Finally, I left early, walking through the crisp Boston air with no destination. My feet carried me to the public garden, where bare trees stood against the winter sky, and ducks floated lazily in the icy pond. Families strolled past me, children laughing, couples holding hands. I watched them with a hollow ache in my chest, remembering when I used to believe holidays meant love and safety. The vibration of my phone startled me. It was Emily again. I answered, bracing myself. Her voice was tight, still thick with emotion. Dad looked through the bank statements. He knows now. He believes you. I sat down heavily on a bench, gripping the phone. What did he say? He cried, Claire. I've never seen him cry like that. He kept saying he didn't deserve it, that he let you down. My throat closed. And Mom. Emily hesitated. She still won't admit anything. She says you only did it to embarrass them. When Dad showed her the proof, she called it manipulation. Of course she did. Emily lowered her voice. Claire, he looked broken. He said he can't face you until he figures out how to explain himself. I leaned back on the bench, eyes stinging. For so long I had wanted my father to see me, to step in to stop her cruelty. Now that he finally knew, it was too late. The damage had already spread through every corner of us. That night, I pulled out the folder where I kept my financial records. I flipped through the printouts, line after line of transactions, proof of my invisible labor. I thought of Robert staring at the same numbers, realizing how blind he had been. And I thought of Margaret, her pride so rigid that even undeniable evidence became another excuse to lash out. The next day, Emily called again. I confronted Mom, she said quietly. I told her she had treated you like garbage, that she drove you away. She screamed at me, Claire. She said I was taking your side, betraying her. Tears pricked my eyes. I'm sorry, Em. You shouldn't have to deal with that. I had to, she insisted. Someone had to tell her. A silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of years we could never get back. Finally, she whispered, I don't know what's going to happen to us anymore. Neither do I. Over the weekend, I tried to lose myself in work at my kitchen table numbers and charts spread out in front of me. But my phone kept buzzing, dragging me back to reality. I listened to one new voicemail from Robert, his voice hoarse. "Claire, I can't stop thinking about what you said, about what you did. I feel like I failed you. I don't know how to fix this." I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks. I wanted to call him back to tell him it wasn't too late. But I couldn't, not yet. On Sunday evening, Emily drove into Boston and knocked on my door. She stood there in her winter coat, her face pale but determined. I let her in, and we sat at my small table with cups of tea. She reached for my hand. "Claire, you need to know this." Dad admitted to me that he used to pretend his part-time job was covering everything because he was ashamed. He said he thought you'd see him as weak if you knew the truth. I shook my head stunned. Weak was never the word I would have used. He was my father. All I wanted was honesty. Emily squeezed my hand tighter. "He knows that now." "But Mom," she told him that if he acknowledged your help, it would mean admitting they couldn't manage on their own. She said it would make them look pathetic in front of the neighbors. A bitter laugh escaped me. Of course, keeping up appearances has always mattered more than love in that house. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if she'll ever change, Claire, but Dad, I think he wants to." I looked down at our joined hands, the steam from our tea curling between us. For the first time in weeks, I felt something like possibility faint and fragile. My father finally knew the truth, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a sliver of space left to be heard. The official notice arrived at my apartment in a thick envelope forwarded by mistake from my parents' address. I stood in my kitchen, holding it like a live wire, the bank's logo stamped in bold at the top. I tore it open, scanning the pages, my breath catching when I saw the words, "Notice of intent to foreclose." The timeline was clear. Unless the account was brought current within 30 days, proceedings would begin. I sank into a chair, the paper trembling in my hands. It was no longer just angry voicemails or Margaret's accusations. The bank had moved beyond warnings. The house that had defined my childhood, for better or worse, was slipping through their fingers. That evening I met Sophia at a small cafe near Copley Square. She had insisted after hearing the weariness in my voice over the phone. I slid the notice across the table and she read it quickly, her eyes narrowing. "Claire, this is serious. They're out of options unless they find a huge amount of money fast." I wrapped my hands around my mug, the tea long gone cold. "They want me to bail them out again." "Do not," Sophia said firmly. "Legally, you are not responsible. You are not on the loan, not on the deed. You have no obligation." I nodded, though guilt gnawed at me. It's still my family's home. Sophia leaned forward. "That house has eaten your peace of mind for years. You kept it standing with your sacrifice, and they still pushed you out. If you step in now, nothing changes." I wanted to argue, but the truth in her words was undeniable. A few days later, Robert called. I answered, this time my voice cautious. "Dad." He sounded tired, older than I remembered. "Claire, I need to see you. Can you meet me?" We arranged to meet at a diner off Route 9, far enough from Newton that Margaret wouldn't appear. He sat in a booth when I arrived, his hands folded, a coffee untouched in front of him. He looked up, eyes red, and gave me a small nod. I slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I saw the statements. I know what you did." My throat tightened. I never wanted it to be a secret. I just knew if Mom found out, she'd turn it against me. He lowered his gaze. "She already has. She told me you did it to humiliate us, to make us feel dependent." "Is that what you believe?" I asked quietly. His eyes lifted to mine, filled with shame. I believe you did it because you love us. And I failed you by letting it happen in silence." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I held them back. "What do you want from me now, Dad?" He sighed, his shoulders sagging. "The bank has given us 30 days. Your mother wants you to co-sign a new loan. She thinks if you attach your income, we can refinance." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course she does." "I can't ask you to do that," he said quickly. I told her no, but she keeps insisting. She says, if you refuse it, proves you never cared about this family. I shook my head, anger rising. She's twisting it again. She always does. His hands trembled as he gripped the mug. I don't know how to stop her. The waitress came by, refilled our coffees, and left without a word. The silence stretched. I finally spoke, my voice steady. I will not sign anything. I've already given more than I should have. You and Mom have to face the truth. You cannot afford that house. Robert's jaw tightened. I know. Selling it may be the only option left. I leaned forward, searching his face. Then do it. Stop bleeding yourselves dry for a facade. He looked like I had struck him, but then he nodded slowly, as if the weight of denial had finally become too heavy to carry. When I left the diner, the cold air stung my face, but I felt something shift inside me. For years I had been the quiet savior patching holes no one acknowledged. Now the truth was out and the burden was no longer mine to carry. That night, as I settled into bed, my phone buzzed with a new voicemail. It was Margaret's voice, icy and furious. If you think you can wash your hands of this family, you are wrong. Without that house, we are nothing, and it will be your fault. I deleted the message without listening further. Set the phone on the nightstand and lay back against the pillows. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest flicker of freedom. The walls of my apartment might have been small, but they were mine, and no one could throw me out. The following week, a thick packet arrived in my mailbox, with my name typed across the front in block letters. For a moment, I thought it was another misdirected notice from the bank, but when I opened it, I found neatly clipped pages from a law firm in Cambridge. My parents had been served with preliminary foreclosure documents, and somehow my address had been added to the contact list. My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages, the legal language stark and cold. The reality was no longer a whisper or a threat. It was happening. That night Emily called. Her voice was tight, exhausted. Claire, Mom is beside herself. She says you can fix this if you just agree to meet with the bank manager. I rubbed my forehead. I am not co-signing anything, Emily. I know. I told her that. She doesn't care. She's convinced if she corners you, she can make you cave. I laughed bitterly. She's underestimated me before, but not this time. Emily hesitated. There's more. She found some old paperwork and is trying to use it as proof that you benefited from living at the house after college. She says you owe them. My jaw tightened. I lived there 6 months after graduation while I saved for my first apartment. I paid rent. Emily's sigh crackled over the line. I believe you, but she won't stop twisting it. The next day at work, I could barely focus. My hands shook as I adjusted my notes for a client meeting. Afterward, I asked Carter if I could take a personal afternoon. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. I walked straight to the bank branch in Newton, the same one where my parents had opened their accounts decades earlier. The manager, a calm woman named Miss Donovan, welcomed me into her office. I handed her the foreclosure notice. I am not on the mortgage, I said firmly. I want that clear. She scanned the paperwork, nodded, and looked up. That is correct. Your name appears nowhere. You have no legal obligation. The words should have lifted a weight, but instead I felt only exhaustion. They've been pressuring me to cover for them, I admitted. Miss Donovan's expression softened. You've been helping, haven't you? I let out a shaky breath. For 3 years, over $200,000. Her eyebrows rose, but she kept her tone steady. That was generous, but you are not required to continue. The law will not hold you accountable. I nodded, a tightness in my chest, easing slightly. Thank you for confirming. When I left the bank, the winter sun was already dipping low. My breath fogged in the air as I stood on the sidewalk, staring at the town I had grown up in. Every storefront, every corner was tied to memories that suddenly felt hollow. That evening, Robert called again. I answered this time. His voice was ragged. Your mother is planning to come see you. She says she won't leave until you sign. A chill ran down my spine. Dad, I'm not signing. I know. I told her it's wrong to ask, but she won't listen to me. Then let her come, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Let her see who I am now. When the knock came 2 nights later, I was ready. Margaret stood in the hallway of my apartment building, wrapped in her fur-collared coat, her lipstick perfectly applied. She swept past me without waiting for an invitation, glancing around the modest space with disdain. "So this is where you live," she said. "Small, cold. No wonder you're bitter." I closed the door and leaned against it. "What do you want, Mom?" She turned, eyes flashing. "I want you to do your duty as a daughter. Sign the loan. Save this family." I crossed my arms. I already saved this family. $200,000. 3 years of my life. And you threw me out on Christmas Eve. She waved a dismissive hand. "You exaggerate. Families fight. Words are said. That doesn't change your responsibility." I stepped closer, my voice shaking but strong. "My responsibility is to myself now, to the life I am building, not to your pride." Her lips tightened. "If we lose the house, it will be on your conscience." "No," I said quietly. "It will be on yours." For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes, a crack in the armor. She straightened quickly, but I had seen it. Margaret grabbed her purse and headed for the door. "You'll regret this." I opened the door for her. "Maybe. But at least I'll regret it on my own terms." When the door shut behind her, I stood in the silence, my heart pounding. The confrontation had drained me, but also left me strangely lighter. For years she had controlled every room she walked into. Not this one, not anymore. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table, staring at the city lights through my window. Outside, Boston pulsed with life. Inside, for the first time, I felt the fragile beginnings of peace. The hum of the city outside my window faded as I sat in the quiet, a calm I had not felt in months. The peace was thin, almost brittle, but it was there and I clung to it. My body was still tense, my shoulders tight from years of waiting for the next blow, yet for once there was no raised voice, no guilt-soaked silence pressing against me. Morning light came sooner than I expected. I woke to the sound of a plow scraping the street below and lay in bed for a long while, staring at the ceiling. The fragile calm from the night before was still with me, but so was the heaviness of what lay ahead. The bank would move forward, neighbors would whisper, and my family would keep calling. When I finally checked my phone, there were 7 missed calls and 3 voicemails. All from Margaret. I didn't press play. I didn't need to hear her voice to know what they contained. She would blame, twist, and demand the way she always did. At work, I tried to push everything aside. Clients trusted me to be steady, not distracted. I wore my best navy blazer, brushed my hair smooth, and practiced my calm expression in the elevator mirror. By the time I stepped onto the 22nd floor, I looked like the Claire they expected. But the mask cracked during lunch. Jenna leaned over my desk with a file and frowned. "Are you all right? You seem pale." I forced a small smile. "Just tired." She hesitated, as if she wanted to ask more, then nodded and left me to my silence. I sat there, staring at the file in my hands, thinking of the foreclosure letters piling up in Newton. That evening, Emily called. Her voice was hushed, like she didn't want anyone in the house to overhear. "Claire, the bank filed the official notice today. It's happening." My breath caught. "How's Dad broken?" she whispered. "He barely speaks. He just sits with a glass in his hand and stares at the television." "And Mom, angry, furious. She's telling everyone you betrayed them. She's already spinning it at church, saying you refused to step in out of spite." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. "Of course she is," Emily's voice cracked. "I'm sorry. Don't apologize. None of this is on you." We stayed on the line for a while, her breathing uneven, mine steady but tired. When we finally hung up, I sat in the dim light of my apartment and let the reality sink in. The house was slipping away. My father was unraveling. My mother was doubling down. 2 days later, Sophia insisted we meet for coffee. We sat in a quiet corner of a shop near Copley Square. I slid the foreclosure notice across the table, and she scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing. "Claire, this is final. They don't have the money, and the bank isn't waiting anymore." "I know. So what happens now?" I wrapped my hands around my cup. "They'll lose the house." Sophia studied me for a moment. "And how do you feel about that?" I swallowed. "Like part of me is relieved. And part of me is grieving something I never really had. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. That's the honest answer, and it's okay to feel both. Later that week, Robert called. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up. His voice was heavy, worn. Claire, I need to see you. Where there's a diner off Route 9, tomorrow evening, please. The next night I found him sitting in a booth by the window, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped, his hair grayer. When I slid into the seat across from him, he gave me a small nod, eyes red. He cleared his throat. I saw the bank papers. It's over, Claire. I folded my hands in my lap. I know, his voice broke. I should have listened to you. I should have told your mother no years ago. I blinked back tears. Dad, what do you want from me now? He looked down at the table. Your mother still thinks if you co-sign a new loan we can save the house. A bitter laugh escaped me. Of course she does. I told her no, he said quickly. I won't let her drag you into this. I studied him waiting. For once there was no excuse in his eyes, only defeat. Then sell it, I said softly. Stop bleeding for a house that's killing you. He flinched but nodded slowly. Maybe it's time. The waitress refilled our coffees, the steam rising between us. We sat in silence, the weight of decades pressing on both of us. When I finally stood to leave, Robert's voice followed me. Claire, I'm sorry. For all of it. I turned back, my throat tight. I know, Dad. Outside the night air was sharp, my breath clouding in the glow of the streetlights. I walked to my car, each step heavier than the last, but my chest felt strangely lighter. For the first time, my father had chosen honesty over silence. Days later, Emily texted me a photo of a white sign in front of the Newton house. For sale. The red letters screamed against the snow. Underneath, she wrote, Mom's still blaming you. I stared at the picture, my eyes burning. Then I typed back 2 words. Let her. The following weekend, I drove past the house. I didn't stop, just slowed enough to see. The shutters looked tired. The driveway, unplowed, the porch sagging a little. A couple stood outside with a realtor, pointing and smiling. I kept driving, the image burning in my mind. Strangers imagining their future in the rooms where I had fought so many private battles. That night, Robert called again. His voice was softer this time. I started a new job, Claire, sales at a hardware store. It's not much, but it feels good to work again. I smiled faintly into the phone. I'm glad, Dad. He hesitated, then said I sold the watch. The Rolex. My breath caught. The gift I had saved for months to buy him, the one that had started the fight on his birthday. I used the money for the deposit on the townhouse. I hope you're not angry. I closed my eyes, tears slipping free. No, Dad, I'm proud of you. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet, staring at the city lights outside my window. The house was nearly gone, my mother still furious, my brother still blind. But my father, for the first time in years, was standing on his own. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. The first snow of February fell heavy, softening the edges of Boston's streets and turning the city into something quieter, calmer. I walked home from the office that evening, my boots crunching in the slush, my breath visible in the glow of the streetlights. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing into someone else's storm. I was walking toward my own life, one I had finally claimed. Emily called as I was hanging up my coat. Her voice carried a mixture of relief and fatigue. The house is gone, Claire. The closing happened this afternoon. They handed over the keys. I stood in the middle of my apartment, staring at the small rug under my feet, letting the words sink in. Gone. The house that had consumed so much of my energy, my money, my hope. It was no longer theirs. Where are they now? I asked. The townhouse in Waltham? It's modest, but Dad says it feels manageable. He actually sounded lighter, and Mom, Emily, exhaled. Still furious, she told the realtor she was humiliated. But she signed the papers. She didn't have a choice. A long silence stretched between us, both of us processing the finality. Then Emily said softly, "Thank you for not giving in. If you had, we'd still be stuck in that cycle." Tears blurred my eyes. For so long I had been the one apologizing, explaining, shrinking to make others comfortable. To hear my sister's gratitude was like feeling sunlight after a long winter. Over the next weeks, I poured my energy into my own home. I painted the walls a deep teal in the living room, hung prints I loved without wondering what anyone would think, and planted herbs in pots by the kitchen window. I invited Sophia over for dinner and she laughed as she chopped vegetables at my counter. "Your place feels alive," she said. I smiled. "So do I. Work flourished too, Mr. Carter called me into his office one afternoon and told me I would be leading my own team starting in the spring. The promotion came with a raise, but more than that, it was recognition. After years of being dismissed at home, my competence and hard work stood on their own. Robert called occasionally. Sometimes it was small talk about his new job. Sometimes it was harder. He apologized again, voice breaking, for not protecting me when I was younger. I listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes with words. Forgiveness wasn't a single act. It was a slow process, a choice I made in pieces. Margaret never called me directly. I heard about her bitterness through Emily, who visited the townhouse often to check on Dad. "She still talks about you like you're the villain," Emily admitted one evening. "But honestly, I think it's her way of protecting herself from guilt." I nodded. Let her. I wasn't going back into the fire to prove I wasn't the one who lit it. One Saturday, Emily and I met for lunch at a diner downtown. We sat across from each other, steam rising from our coffee mugs, and for the first time in years, the conversation wasn't heavy. We talked about her kids, about a book club she had joined, about the way Dad was making friends at his new job. When the check came, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You saved yourself, Claire. And somehow you saved the rest of us too." I swallowed hard, the words settling deep. Maybe that was the truth. Maybe stepping away had been the only way to change anything at all. As spring approached, I adopted a cat from a local shelter, a calm orange tabby I named Leo. He followed me from room to room, curling on my lap while I read or stretching out by the window, as if he too had found a safe place. Life wasn't perfect. Some nights I still woke from dreams of Margaret's voice, sharp and cutting. Some mornings I caught myself staring at old photos, wondering how things might have been different if love had come without conditions. But each day I built a little more peace, one choice at a time. The last time I drove past the old house, new shutters had been installed, and bright curtains hung in the windows. A child's bicycle leaned against the porch. It looked nothing like the place I had grown up in. And for once that didn't hurt. It felt like closure. I turned the corner, leaving it behind, and let the road carry me back toward Boston, toward the life I had chosen. If you've ever walked away from a family that drained you, or set a boundary that others refused to understand, I hope my story gives you strength. Share your own experiences in the comments. I'd love to hear how you found your way forward. And if this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe, so you can join me for more stories about resilience, family, and the power of reclaiming your life.